Thank you for spending a few minutes with us. I know you've got a hectic schedule today. We mentioned just a few of the organizations you're a part of, but I couldn't let you get out of here without tapping your expertise and your thoughts, because there's so many interesting and challenging currents going on around the world, and we could spend all day just working through just the first few. But how do you see this transition the global economy is going through? We talk about the rise of the intangible economy, a capital-light economy, capitalism without capital in terms of real fiscal structure capital. Data matters, it's a knowledge-based economy. You and Singapore in some ways are a microcosm of this transformation. How do you see both the challenges and opportunities globally as you've had this experiment you've run already?
No, thank you. And thank you very much for the opportunity, Tim, and thank you very much for this inaugural award. I think, if you think of what's on all our minds, what's truly unusual today is the fact that it's a confluence of many different uncertainties. First and foremost, geopolitical, domestic political, and it's not a passing phenomenon, it's domestic political tensions, uncertainties, questions about the future evolution of liberal democracies that are underpinned by more fundamental bifurcations in society. And it's creating a sense of uncertainty which you can't put your finger on too precisely, but we know that things are not the same as what they were before. There's uncertainty over the management of our economies globally, uncertainty over what happens in the next downturn. We know that there's probably no game in town. Central banks are becoming less effective in their policy actions. They have policy actions, but the effectiveness of their policy actions, I think, are far less effective than before. There's a lack of readiness on the part of fiscal authorities to step up to the plate and to think of interventions that are not just counter-cyclical, but which help change the longer-term trajectory of economies. There's fundamental uncertainty now because of not so much the trade conflict, because that creates an immediate short-term uncertainty, but the technological rifts that are now part and parcel of the global landscape. It's not a passing phase, but if you talk to corporate leaders, if you talk to all of us in the policy-making world, we are profoundly concerned. The prospect of a bifurcation or fragmentation of global supply chains, of the way in which technologies add value and create productivity in the global economy is a fundamental uncertainty now facing the global economy. And then you have the slow burn issues. I'm talking here about the confluence of many different uncertainties, but you have the slow burn issues. The most neglected is probably the pensions crisis. It's coming. It's a looming crisis across the advanced world, and defined contribution and that democratization of pensions hasn't worked out the way it was meant to. And we have a huge problem coming, both in defined benefit and defined contribution schemes. A slow burn issue, but slow burning issues eventually end up in a fire. And then you've got climate change, the most profound existential challenge facing nations individually and the global community. So it's all coming together, and I think the policy responses, the discussions, what you see on the front page headlines, tend to be the very short-term issues. Does the Fed cut by another 0.25 percentage point? Do you go for QE, or do you go for further interest rate cuts? These are short-term issues. They're traditional issues that were suited to a counter-cyclical framework, smoothing the cycles. They don't address these fundamental issues, which are political, structural, and they're about the evolution of global collective responsibility for global problems that are going to affect all of us.
You have visitors from all around the world who come in and use Singapore as a model for how to do things right. What is your secret sauce? Is it investment in human capital? Is it investment in good government? You obviously have world-class infrastructure. What's the secret sauce?
Well, first, I think, it has to be said that Singapore does very little that it invents on its own, or that we devise on our own. We are constantly looking around the world in every sphere, whether it's education or R&D or the way we organize industry clusters. We're constantly looking to the rest of the world to observe best practices and find a way of adapting it to our own needs. Our partners are critical to us. As a small economy, corporate partners, unions, community partners are critical as a small society. Our relationship with leading global companies is frankly fundamental to the way we run our economy, constantly looking ahead with each of them. What's the next technology? What's the problem you find in Singapore or in the region? How can we help you to overcome it? Always looking ahead and trying to see how through our responses on the supply side, developing capabilities, and their responses by actually getting innovation on the ground and commercializing it, how we can just stay one step ahead of the game. And that's continuous work. So most of what we do in the economic sphere is one of partnership and looking outward. Where we are a little unique is in social policies, particularly housing policy and the way we organize neighborhoods. Social urban policy is probably the most unique feature of Singapore's broad mix of policies. And it's been, frankly, an extremely important part of how Singapore has succeeded, not so much as an economy, but as a society. How do you keep an inclusive society where you have many ethnicities, many religions, and where you have the traditional problems all over the world of rich and poor increasingly being segregated? So we've avoided it by creating housing neighborhoods for the vast majority of our population that are mixed, that are integrated. And that has a dynamic of its own. It has a dynamic of its own that's social, that is psychological, and ultimately is also a source of competitiveness.
One of the dampening elements on global growth, and we've seen the WEO that was just out over the last couple of days, the fund is pretty pessimistic with respect to 2020 and even the end of this year, is trade tensions and the potential decoupling of US and China and the implications that has for supply chains as they move around. How is Singapore prepared, A, just for the cyclical changes that are occurring and a shift in those supply chains to other parts of Asia, or maybe even some of that production moving back to the US?
Well, global growth is being downgraded, IMF, everyone. But more important than that number, whether it's 3% or 3.2%, is composition. The world is running on consumption growth today. US, China, India, Europe, it's running on consumption growth. It's not running on investment growth. And the reasons why investment is weak globally, not just in individual economies, has something to do with that confluence of uncertainties that we are talking about. And it's not so much about traditional risks. Risks can be quantified and priced. It's uncertainties that can't be priced. And that's what's dampening investment in a whole set of sectors. It's too broad, it's too cross-sectoral, it's too global to be explained by specific sectoral issues or the idiosyncrasies of politics or economic policy in individual economies. We face a global problem, profound uncertainty over the future, and I would say profound denial over the nature of the problem.
One of the great advantages of being at the MAS offices was you could see the harbor and the shipping coming in. I always love the views, like going to HKMA8, you can see the harbor.
But you can't do it anymore by the way, because we've shifted the harbor.
Shifted it. So, but I always enjoyed looking out the window, and you could see that's capitalism, it's global trade, and its current physical manifestation. But with the dematerialization of global growth, of global activity, how does Singapore make that transition? It's about data and knowledge now.
No, you're quite right. So, I mean, our place in the world is to try to add value in global supply chains and regional supply chains of all forms. Manufacturing is what created the takeoff in Singapore a few decades ago. It's still a very important part of the Singapore economy, advanced manufacturing, but it's now broader than that. We've got the next generation of logistics, and the port and airport are still very important parts of the Singapore economy. It's about finance. It's about everything to do with urban solutions, including green urban solutions. So the services economy, together with an advanced manufacturing economy, are both about, for Singapore, are both about finding a way in which we are adding value to a global value chain. And if we can do that well, as a small economy, we've got a good future. Being small has obvious disadvantages. We don't have a large domestic market, we don't have a large population base, but the advantage of being small is that if you can do something well, if you can focus on something that you can do well, there's enough of a global market. There's always a market. Short of a global depression, there's a market for high quality products and services, but you've got to do it well. And it means constantly upgrading your capabilities so that you're with that next technology or with that next way of delivering a product. You're always part of the future.
I like the phrase, only the paranoid survive, right? You have to be a little paranoid about dramatic change and being left behind. Let's switch. You're a multilateralist, an internationalist, a globalist. You have shown leadership, one of the reasons for the award, in international forum. This is the 75th anniversary of the Bretton Woods institutions. I know you're committed to the institutions. I am. We want to see these institutions evolve, and we think that they've done a great job. How do we build the case for the importance of multilateralism, which has become a bit of a tattered phrase? And what must the Bretton Woods institutions look like in the future to remain relevant?
So I think first, we can't recreate the old multilateralism. And it's not to be honest, it was something which it never functioned well. It's not as if there's some glorious era that we've now passed. We're now past. It never worked well. We have to accept the reality now of a multipolar world, an ascendant China. We've got to form networks, what we call networks of cooperative internationalism, around specific initiatives, climate being the largest challenge, but there are several other challenges. If we don't invest adequately in Africa and the emerging world, we have a global issue. It'll be tragic for Africa, but it's also of global consequence. And that's a huge issue, because the size of the young population in the emerging world today, if you just take Africa alone, the size of the young population that is about to enter the workforce is about 3 times larger than China at its peak. But Africa today is much less prepared than China was at that time 3 decades ago. Much less prepared in education levels, basic as well as beyond basic to the tertiary level of education. And it's a very serious issue. Investments in infrastructure and human capital in Africa and the emerging world are a global issue. And if we don't sort that out, we get a compounding of problems that are already beginning to show up. Forced migration, the health pandemics, plus the fact that you lose out on the opportunity of a very large growth market for the world economy. It just bears repeating, because again, this doesn't feature in the headlines and the front page stories. 2/3 of the growth in the last decade was in the emerging world. A bit less than 1/3 of growth was in China, and a bit more than 1/3 in the rest of the emerging world. If we don't think hard about how capital can flow in a reliable way to fund investments in the developing world, global growth as a whole is going to be very weak, not just for next year or the year after. It's going to be very weak for many years to come. And we're not just talking about the SDGs.
Right.
We're talking about median wage growth across the advanced world. We need the emerging world to sustain global growth. We need China, we need India, we need Africa, we need Latin America. And those are global issues. And to be frank, today's system of multilateralism as well as cooperative internationalism isn't addressing the issues fundamentally. We need a lot more capital to be invested in the emerging world, and it means addressing issues of risk and perceptions of risk. And plain vanilla techniques of diversifying and pooling risk have barely been used in the emerging world. Pooling together infrastructure risks, pooling together political risk, having plain vanilla securitization so that you bring in institutional investors to invest in very simple synthetic asset classes. These are, they're not fancy ideas. They're not sort of financial engineering. They're just using the basic precepts of finance for investments in the emerging world. So it can be done, but it requires everyone to play together. It requires the multilateral entities, the MDBs and the IMF, the regional entities, AIIB and the other regional banks, and very importantly, it requires the bilateral players, because the bilateral players today are the largest part of development finance. And today, it's still a fragmented world, each doing their own thing, sometimes even undercutting each other. We've got to bring all parties together to achieve scale and impact in Africa and the developing world. And then you've got climate. Climate is the existential crisis of our era. It is inherently an issue of collective action, whether it's on the carbon tax, whether it's on investment in mitigation and adaptation, and whether it's on financial regulation, which has to be a critical part of it. Financial regulation as well as market norms to start steering investment towards renewables and towards green investments generally is a critical issue for the next decade. Absolutely critical. If we don't do it in this next decade, we have a huge amount of infrastructure that's coming that's going to lock us into a path of unsustainability for much more than a decade.
We just had our board meeting this morning, and sustainability, green finance is one of the most prominent topics. There's a broader range of topics, but some of it is just standardization. There is no definition of what is green. We have a taxonomy of multiple definitions. Some of it is just, it's tough to invest when you don't have an agreement on what it is you're investing in, or how to call it, how to standardize it, how to benchmark it, how to disclose it. So part of the process is the official sector needs to work with the industry to standardize the way we think about green, sustainable projects. But back to your point about capital flows from the developed world to the developing world, we've got $16 trillion worth of negative yielding bonds. There's this constant hunt for yield, maybe in illiquid assets, and yet the picture you've painted is an emerging market that has great returns that we should be investing in. Why don't we see the capital flowing from excess savings to those places where it could be utilized and we could really get the kind of returns that pension funds need to produce?
So I think the problem today is that the capital does flow, but it's volatile, it's short-term, and it's very sensitive to small changes in monetary policy in the advanced world. It's risk on, risk off. It's not reliable long-term capital that's going into infrastructure especially, and other longer-term direct investments in the main. We used to think that the problem was that developing countries just didn't have their houses in order. And there have been lessons well learnt from the Asian crisis, from various Latin American crises, from crises generally. But to be frank, getting your own house in order is not good enough. The neighborhood has to play its part, and the neighborhood is not just the countries around you, the neighborhood is the advanced world and the emerging world together. We need new norms of policy making in the advanced world to achieve domestic objectives, whether it's employment, inflation, growth, we need new norms on the mix of monetary, fiscal, macroprudential, and structural policies so that you can achieve domestic objectives in the US, in the UK, in France, without the very large spillovers that we see today. If you concentrate your fire on monetary policy alone, and particularly QE, it has much larger spillovers for the world than if you have a mix of policies, monetary, fiscal, macroprudential, and structural policies to achieve domestic objectives. And we have post-GFC, post-global financial crisis, we've concentrated overwhelmingly on monetary policy. And the costs of that concentration are now growing, and the benefits are diminishing.
You know, Mario Draghi made those comments at Jackson Hole 3 years ago. He made them as a swan song set of comments. It has to be about structural reform. It has to be about fiscal authorities. But why haven't we seen those two pieces of the puzzle become more pronounced and more effective? There is this reliance on central bankers to solve all of our problems.
So I wouldn't blame central bankers for trying to fulfill their mandate. But I think this is part of a larger problem of fiscal policy having become too short-term, too focused on immediate redistribution rather than on regeneration and longer-term investments in public goods. If you look at the fiscal balance sheets of many countries, a few decades ago, public goods were very important, of one form or another: transport, various other forms of infrastructure, human capital, and so on. Now, a very large part of fiscal balance sheets is transactional. It's about, you've got tax revenues and how do you distribute it, and it's about transfers and benefits. You need transfers and benefits, and you need a progressive fiscal system, but it has to be founded first and foremost on investment in growth and investment in public goods. And investment in public goods all over the world tend to benefit the bottom 50% of the population more than the average. So we've got to get back to a longer-term orientation in fiscal policy. And if you think today at the needs of the advanced world, I was talking earlier on about the emerging world, but if you think of the needs of the advanced world, there's a massive need for renewal of infrastructure. There's a massive need to invest in climate change mitigation. There is a massive need to address the slow burn pensions crisis, because it's unsustainable, and if we don't sort it out, it's going to impose an inequitable burden on the next generation. And there's a need to think globally about ways in which we can mitigate risk for investments to flow to the emerging world in everyone's interests. So the ideas are not greatly complex, but it does require a long-term orientation in fiscal policy. And you can only get a long-term orientation if you have what you call in the US some sort of bipartisan consensus, or put another way, you just need to have faith in the center of politics. Because without trust in politics, without trust in institutions, it's very hard to take a long-term perspective of things. Things reduce themselves to what happens in the next elections.
So the final word is trust. We need more trust.
But you have to create it, and you have to earn it with policies for inclusive growth and policies that get ordinary people to know that, look, we're going to do this now, there's some costs, some adjustments, but we're all going to benefit eventually. There must be that sense of inclusivity, that this is not about the elite, it's not about financial institutions, it's not about one segment of society only, but we are all going to move up.
A new social contract.
Effectively.
Tharman, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen,